to our Confluence Center community who are either joining us on Zoom or on Facebook Live virtually. My name is Yadira Caballero, and I have greeted and introduced myself in my Navajo language by providing my clans. I belong to the Reed People clan and Born for the Mexican. On behalf of the Confluence Center for Creative Inquiry at the University of Arizona, we welcome you all to our second Fronteridades lecture series for the fall semester. The lecture series this afternoon is focused on transborder community radio. We are looking forward to hear from two speakers to share about the history of commercial radio programming by Mexican-owned stations along the border during radio's golden age, and about their knowledge, experience, and impact on community radio on the border. As we live in a current moment of transition, we have to continue to understand and listen of the long-standing history and stories that has brought you to reside on the land. This land is part of who we are. It is part of our past, our current, and our future. We should carry the respectfulness of the people who have been here thousands of generations and will continue for generations to come. If we can take the moment to acknowledge the University of Arizona is located on the native homelands of the Tohono Nation and the lands of the Pascua Yaqui tribe. They are the ones whose care and keepings of these lands allows us to be here today. Whether you are joining us here in Tucson, in the surrounding area of the Salt River Valley, including the Akamo Atam, Pima, and Peeposh Maricopa Indian communities, or in other areas of place in relation to the original people of the land, it is imperative that we continue to carry these reflections where you currently reside, and we need to build our mindfulness of our present participation. Now, transitioning to housekeeping updates, after the presentation, we will open it up for a Q&A, but feel free to address questions at any time in the Q&A box located at the bottom of the screen or in the comment box on Facebook Live. We will try our best to get them answered at the end of the presentations. All right, so now I would like to introduce you to Javier Duran, who is the director of the Confluence Center for Creative Inquiry and professor of Latin American and Border Studies, who will provide some quick updates and introductions. So Ahihat, and take it away, Javier.
Thank you, Yadira. Welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us in this very special session about Transborder Community Radio. I'm really excited and thankful to our presenters today for having accepted our invitation to join us. And also, I want to express our deep thanks to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for funding the Fronteridades program, as well as my deep gratitude to the Confluence Center team, which makes all of this possible. Gracias, Ángela Martínez, Yasmin Vázquez, Yadira Caballero, Cristian Rubalcaba, Valeria Tapia, and Drew Batia, who are members of the Conference Center team. Just briefly, I want to share that recently we've been named a recipient of a $400,000 grant awarded by the National Endowment of the Humanities through their program. Funding for the grant will allow us for a cross-institutional collaboration with the University of Arizona Press, the Alfie Norville Gem and Mineral Museum here in Tucson, and the Writing Skills Program in the start of a new project named Reclaiming Cultural Heritage in the Borderlands. So that's an exciting news for the Confluence Center for our University of Arizona community. And I also want to remind you that we'll have a show and tell, part of our extended series of programming on November 16th. So register for that. It's gonna be a really cool event with some of our local pandemediarios recipients here. And with that, I also want to welcome our moderator, Deluxe today, Miranda Schubert. She joined us from KXCI. where she was a former member of the KXCI education team, and she's been a long-time DJ for KXCI and a very esteemed member of our Tucson community. Miranda, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And with that, take it away. Miranda would introduce our speakers tonight and would moderate the session. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that warm introduction, Javier. It's an honor to be here. Really excited to moderate a couple of really amazing speakers today are on the slate. So just a few words about Fronteridades, Nurturing Collaborative Intersections in the U.S.-Mexico Borderlands Program. It's based at the University of Arizona and aimed at collecting and sharing the stories and art of people at the U.S.-Mexico border while creating new learning opportunities. The program is supported by a 2-year grant from the Higher Education and Scholarship in the Humanities program of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And it's part of the university's larger aim to become the leading institution for Borderlands scholarship, also dubbed its Border Lab Initiative. So through its program activities, Fronteridades seeks to achieve 2 major goals. The first is to narrate the border, to collect, understand, and share the narrative stories, art, and effects of those from and crossing through the US-Mexico border for local and non-local audiences. The second is to expand border learning, to create opportunities for experiential learning in, on, and of the US-Mexico border for scholars and interested people across fields and disciplines. To strengthen connections with the people and organizations on the ground at the border will not only foster an environment of intellectual and artistic autonomy in border communities, but it will also create new possibilities for dialogue and allow for previously non-existent opportunities of student learning, research, and collaboration. So now to introduce today's speakers and topics. Dr. Sonia Robles is an assistant professor of Latin American history and Latinx studies at the University of Delaware. She writes and teaches about broadcast media history, Mexico, and the US-Mexico border. In 2019, the University of Arizona published her book, Mexican Waves, Radio Broadcasting Across Mexico's Northern Border, 1930 to 1950, which recently received an honorable mention for the best book in the humanities by the Latin American Studies Association, Mexico section. And just a few words about the lecture for today. Ondas Mexicanas, Cross-Border Radio Advertising, will offer a brief history of commercial radio programming by Mexican-owned stations along the border during radio's golden age. It will explain how Spanish and English language advertisements broadcast over Mexican airwaves targeted Latinos in the United States and promoted both Mexican and Anglo consumption practices. And to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Monica de la Torre. She's an assistant professor of media and expressive culture in the School of Transborder Studies at Arizona State University. Her interdisciplinary research and teaching practices bridge Chicana feminist theory, Latinx feminist media studies, radio and sound studies, and women's and gender studies. As a scholar practitioner of digital media and radio, she analyzes both media content and production practices in articles and public scholarship featured in WSQ, Women's Studies Quarterly, New Review of Film and Television Studies, Current. Also Current, which is news for people in public media, and Sounding Out, the Sound Studies blog. Her forthcoming book, Feminista Frequencies, Community Building Through Radio in the Yakima Valley, tracks the emergence of Chicano community radio in rural farm worker communities, starting in the 1970s. And then just a brief overview of the lecture on the slate. Chicano radio broadcasters, including disc jockeys, producers, and radio station managers, are often silenced in dominant media histories that recount the golden age of radio as predominantly white and male. Through development and application of a Feminista Frequencies methodology, she has harnessed visual archives in her research of community radio broadcasters to establish how Chicanas innovated Spanish language radio to center their voices and narratives. In this talk, she will be presenting findings from her forthcoming book, Feminista Frequencies, Community Building Through Radio in the Yakima Valley, which tracks the emergence of Chicano public broadcasting in the Pacific Northwest and examines how radio became the most effective medium for reaching relatively isolated farm worker communities of the region. Indeed, community radio offered Chicanas a space to create unique content for their community. She will also be sharing new research on how this Feminista Frequencies method has uncovered yet another Chicana broadcaster in the archives, Gloria Olivarez, the first woman disc jockey in Arizona. So definitely be sure to jot down any questions or put it in the Q&A when they come to your mind, because there will be time afterward for our speakers to answer your questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, everyone that is here. We are very excited. Sonia and I are just thrilled to be here to share our work. I'll be going first, and I'll be talking about my book, and really look forward to your comments and questions. So I will be sharing my screen now. Okay. Great. So we are, just really excited to be here, and this is the first time I'm in conversation with Sonia in this way, so I'm just really excited to hear more about her work. And we just thank everybody that has put in time and effort to get this organized. And we just want to thank the Confluencer Center for Creative Inquiry, Dr. Duran, all of the staff, Angela, Yasmin, and Miranda. Thank you so much for the invitation and for putting this on. So we wanted to give a brief overview of how we see the topic of transborder community radio and commercial radio, how that theme plays throughout our research. So for both of our talks today, we want to explore and explain how Spanish language radio managers and creators engage with the Mexican immigrant diaspora. And we are, and in my work especially, that isn't necessarily physically at the border, but really radio shows us how the border travels, right? And so I will be really focusing on the ways in which transborder experiences migrate from places along the border to the rest of the United States. We will focus on transborder radio producers, Chicana and Chicano radio broadcasters making really important programming decisions, as well as the behind the microphone creative workers. So for my talk today on Feminista Frequencies, Chicana radio broadcasters in the digital borderlands, I will be mostly focusing on research from my forthcoming book and an exciting new project that I have underway. But what I want to do is really talk about what this work means in terms of both archiving and finding materials in the archive, which in my experience for Chicana radio broadcasters is not very easy to find. So I really want us to think about the ways in which transborder, both a theoretical lens, but also a transborder methodology really helps us to understand things like community radio when radio programs, or any other artifacts from the station aren't easily found. So just to give you some a brief overview of where I situate my work. So I am a interdisciplinary scholar. I have my PhD in feminist studies, but I have a really strong background in Chicana feminist theory. I have my master's in Chicano studies, and I really have always been interested in centering women in particular in histories of Chicano cultural production. This work really stems from the intersection of Chicana feminist theory, Chicano movement studies, and activism in general. And so my work really does begin at the intersection of the women's movement, the Chicano movement, and the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967. These three social political events really shaped the emergence of Chicano community radio stations. So as you see here on both this map and the map that's in my background, it has a selection of some of the community radio stations that were started in the late 1970s through the 80s. This isn't an exhaustive list, but merely a visual representation of where we had Chicano community radio at this time. And I think what this visual map does is, one, it really cements that our communities are national, that we are everywhere within the United States and outside of the United States, that the border travels with those communities that, for example, I'll talk about the farm workers that started the station in Radio Cadena in the Yakima Valley in Washington. A lot of them migrated or were on the migrant track for following the crops, starting in Texas, Arizona, through California, Oregon, and a lot ended up in Washington. And so the impact of what happens when our communities migrate to different locations, they don't do so in isolation. They do so with their cultural knowledge, their costumbres, their customs. And so radio is definitely one of those very strong traditions for Mexican American communities. But for Chicano community radio in particular, the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967, which created what we now know as National Public Radio, NPR, the Public Broadcasting Service, PBS. Before that, commercial radio was very much the dominant medium, right? We have educational radio prior to 1967, but the Public Broadcasting Act really revolutionized the airwaves. And for Chicanas and Chicanos in particular, it meant that it gave them the opportunity to start their own radio stations. And so in the late, 60s through the 1970s, there was a convergence of a Chicano activist that, if you study the Chicano movement, we know that there was activism across the board in different areas of labor and education and politics and feminisms. And so that energy of feeling that having access to the airwaves was yet another civil rights issue was sort of the what charged a lot of the Chicano community radio producers early on. And so my work really looks at how both Chicano radio stations began, but also the role of women within those stations. And so again, as you see here, Radio Cadena, which started in 1979, was the second, the first full-time Spanish language, but the second after KBBF FM in Santa Rosa, California, who came on the scene in 1973 with a bilingual radio station, again, where farm workers, student activists, and media activists came together to start the station. So this, again, really does show that there were pockets of a lot of activism around public radio and community radio. So how did I get here? I have a background in community radio myself. In the mid-2000s, I had graduated undergrad from UC Davis and really didn't know what I was going to do with my life. I thought I was going to go to law school, and that didn't pan out. So I decided to work and see, what was in store for me. And I found a group of really amazing young people called Soul Rebel Radio, who were on the radio in KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, which is a Pacifica radio station. And they presented at a conference that I attended and said that they needed volunteers to be on the radio. And as someone that grew up with listening to the radio with my mom in the car, and just I've always loved radio, I jumped at the chance of being able to volunteer for this group. And so I really stepped into this area with no prior experiences in broadcasting or media production. And this experience shaped me, to my core, that it set me off into a trajectory where I now am studying radio. But here's a picture of me on the bottom right, where you can see I'm here at the KPFK studios. And back then I thought, well, there must not be that many, many of us on the radio. I hadn't heard of Chicanas on the radio, really. I didn't know about the history of Chicano public broadcasting. And so I really didn't have that knowledge. But as I started to do this work, I did my graduate studies at the University of Washington, and my advisor, Dr. Michelle Hebo-Payan, saw that I had experience in radio and said, there's a radio station here that maybe you'd be interested in learning more about. And that's Radio Cadena KDNA in Granger, Washington. And that blew my mind that there was women, Chicanas, before me, you know, in the 70s and 80s, doing the same thing that I was doing. And then I was, well, of course they were there, right? As I started to learn more about feminisms and the role of Chicanas within the Chicano movement, I realized that, you know, even if we're not within the narrative, sometimes our presence is still there. And so that really set off my trajectory to become interested in this work. So I've been working closely with Rosa Ramon, who's pictured here on the left of your screen. She was one of the co-founders, the only woman co-founder, and the first station manager for Radio Cadena. And we've together have done extensive archival collection research. She did an amazing job as station manager early on of documenting, of taking pictures. And so because of her and because of a lot of the work of these women, I can now you know, rely on creating this digital archive for future scholars and students and community members. So working with Rosa was, again, really instrumental in getting a lot of this information that I'm presenting today. So I just want to thank her. But what I found out at Radio Cadena is that not only were they, you know, one of the first Spanish language community radio stations, they had a really interesting practice within the station that they really encouraged women to be, you know, volunteers and paid staff. The team at Radio Cadena was able to tap into a lot of institutional resources and grants that were being given at the time. So they recruited farm workers to come and learn how to produce radio. Some of the early work that Radio Cadena did was training farm worker youth in radio production. And so this idea that we are only going to cultivate our talent by teaching each other is exactly the spirit that I learned radio, right? As I said, I didn't come in with any experience, but we all stepped in with the mission of wanting to create programming by, for, and about our communities, which we didn't hear at the time. And this was, again, the model that I saw had been operating at Radio Cadena. So that is where my work again, centers the voices and narratives of these women. But part of this work is thinking through what the impact was of women broadcasters on the airwaves. And part of this is that they influence programming choices, they influence production practices. For example, they decided that they were not allow any sexist content to be aired or sexist songs. We know that a lot of Mexican music, unfortunately, ranchera music sometimes can be degrading toward women. And so early on, Radio Cadena's producers and leadership thought that it was important to not replicate that on the airwaves, right? Knowing that they were trying to create an environment for families, for children, for everyone to listen to the radio station. And so that very much is part of that work that I term Chicana radio praxis or Chicana radio activism, right? Where we have a very explicit call out, right, to not just include women, but to make them important stakeholders, to put them in positions of leadership. And this is what we saw at Radio Cadena. Some of the programming at the station, again, very family-oriented, wanting to address the needs of all members of the community. They produced a children's show called El Jardín de los Niños, kindergarten, which was a children's show every morning. It's still actually on the air today. And a lot of local community children would call in, ask for songs or give dedications, dedicas. They had a show for specifically women and about women's issues called Mujer, where they would invite community members to speak on different topics that range from cooking shows to social services, child, education and care, as well as domestic violence and incest. And in fact, as I was doing my work for the book, and part of my work is also doing oral histories, one of the station managers after Rosa, Ricardo Garcia, shared with me that the incest segment brought in a lot of calls because it's a topic that at the time really wasn't talked about in the community. It's a very taboo issue, but they realized that it was such an important space, that radio was a space that facilitated dialogue. As a lot of folks talk about, radio sometimes provides anonymity, right? It provides a sense of intimacy, but you're not showing your face if you are, calling in. So while you can go on the air and talk about really, sensitive topics, it does provide in some ways a space where you can have those conversations. Another show, again, appealing to the farm worker communities, Amanecer Ranchero, to get folks up in the morning bright and early to get their day started. And then another really impactful show that was actually nationally syndicated was Tres Hombres Sin Fronteras. And this was a radionovela or a radio drama that focused on HIV/AIDS prevention. So again, a lot of the topics that Radio Cadena included in their broadcasting was very much influenced by the producers, right? And what they saw the needs of the community. A lot of the information of some of the early Chicano radio stations, I was able to track through this article on the left that Rosa wrote. So part of the archiving process is the archiving in the moment, the recognizing that the work is important and should be documented. And so part of my my own work in doing this is that I've recognized that station documents and non-audio materials become very integral to the documentation process of establishing some of the what were the shows that were on air, who were the people involved, right? And so a lot of these non-audio artifacts become very important clues to telling the whole story of Radio Cadena. You see here more images. As I said, the archive that we've built together, both Rosa and I, is very rich in visual materials, which I feel is very impactful. It shows us, again, seeing women at the controls, seeing women in front of the microphone. For me, as again, with a background in this, just made me really excited and made me really happy that we've been part of media making for generations, right? For years and years and years, even though the narrative around media production is that it's very male driven, right? It's very typically focused on white and white representation. But what these images show us is that that is not necessarily the case. Okay. So the next image here is more of the women radio producers, broadcasters, and volunteers during their first fund drive. So part of community radio broadcasting is having to raise your own money sometimes for operations. So this is Rosa's in the middle here, Bernice Zuniga, Celia Prieto, Maria Estela Rebollosa, and Estela del Villar. These are all the women that were at the time in the early 80s, some of the producers of the shows that I just talked about, like Mujer, Amanecer Ranchero, Tres Hombres Sin Fronteras. And again, it has been really important for me, not just to collect this information and these images and the program guides and all of that, but also to make this publicly accessible. One of the biggest issues that we face as media studies scholars, especially Mexican radio and Chicano radio, is the lack of archival resources. And so part of my own work is to create a public-facing, publicly accessible online archive that will house all of these materials so that folks can not just go and see the pictures, but listen to some of the radio programs that we have been able to locate and archive. Here's another image of Celia Prieto editing at the reel-to-reel machine. this work, now we have digital editing, but back then you had to edit tape and slice it with a razor blade and tape it back together. So I think the actual labor behind these radio programs is also a really important area to discuss, right? That this was a very skilled process. It wasn't something that anybody could just go in and do. In some of the interviews that I've done, and in my own experience, learning how to produce media is a very empowering experience. For Celia, who's pictured here, she talks about how being able to go onto the radio helped her transition from farm work to becoming a radio broadcaster. She started taking college classes and other types of courses, right, to help her. She learned how to write news, right, record it, edit, and all of that are skills that I think are very much not talked about when it comes to production, right? That this is something that we don't really recognize within media production. You have here a picture of me meeting for the first time Bernice Zuniga, and it's just been a really fascinating to talk to these women, because as I share with them my own story, that prior to learning radio production, I was shy and not very outgoing, and learning how to make my own radio programs and hearing my voice on the radio completely shifted my own experience of my own agency. And it's very similar for these women, right? That they were able to go out into the community for the first time and do really important work and cover stories that weren't being covered by mainstream media, right? And to produce it in a language that at the time, wasn't very popular to have, right, on the radio, to have public Spanish language radio. So that's been really exciting to be able to talk to these women. But now to just transition quickly to a new project, and I'm happy to answer any questions. There's so much richness in this work, but I want to make sure that I give time to the second project, because what I've found is that, again, the visual archive is what's helping us tell the stories of radio. And here you see someone else that I have found in the archive, which I'm really thrilled about. This is Gloria Olivarez. She was the first woman disc jockey in Arizona, in Phoenix. She went on the radio in 1951. And like a lot of women that I've talked to, she went on the air by accident. A disc jockey didn't show up one day and they needed somebody to cover the airtime. Graciela had been working for this radio station. It was an advertising, Spanish language advertising firm. She had been working there as a secretary, and the day that the DJ didn't show up, they turned to her and asked her to go on the air. And so she gathered her records and started playing Mexican music, and everybody loved her. She got letters, people asking, when is Graciela going to be back on the air? And she ended up producing many radio shows at different radio stations, commercial radio stations in the Phoenix area. Graciela Olivarez is such an interesting figure. Prior to me joining the faculty at ASU, again, I had not heard of Graciela or her work, but thankfully we have her work here at the ASU Chicano Research Collection. We have over 600 images of her life and work. And this was a person that didn't only impact radio and television broadcasting. She ended up owning her own Spanish language television broadcast station. This was a person that went on and had a very extensive political and activist career. She went on to work for foundations. She was the first woman graduate of Notre Dame Law School. She was Jimmy Carter's director of the Community Services Agency, Jimmy Carter's highest ranking Latina during his administration. And so again, what this work is showing me is that whether or not we hear or learn about different types of marginalized communities in the media, sometimes we have to be creative in our digging for these histories. So this new project on Gloria Olivarez, I just published a photo essay along with Dr. Christine Marin, who is the founding archivist and historian for the ASU Chicano collection, and collected Graciela's archive. And it's been really fascinating to, again, see images of women as media producers. You see her here at studios of KPHX. And then on the right, we see her here actually with, I just found out, her sister and her mother. So again, Graciela is just another one of the Chicanas on the radio that we need to learn more about. As Graciela transitioned from her radio work to her own political career, she she went from interviewer to interviewee. She worked for Governor Jerry Apodaca in New Mexico, and as a result, went on a lot of television interviews. And here we have images of her at the Val de la O show, which was like a interview talk show in New Mexico. And actually, this is another little gem, not even little, but another gem that I found in the archive. This is a show I had not come across in my research of public broadcasting. And it's really been able to show me that there's just so much to learn about Chicanas and Chicanos in broadcasting. But these are just some images of her on the set of this radio show. And as I mentioned, I am working on this public, archive, online archive, where I will host and stream a lot of the materials that I've used in my research and talk about in the book. So I'm hoping that this project can get traction nationally so that I can expand it. Hoping that, because as I showed you, right, there's not just one radio station, but there are several that deserve to have their histories documented and archived. And so part of this work is twofold in writing about it, but then also, again, the important aspect of making this information accessible, because there's no point in writing about radio if you can't listen and see some of it, right? And see some of the images that I've collected. So this is the prototype website that you can, if you wish to check out. There's a few videos on there. There's some more program guides and photographs. But I'm hoping that this work really shows us that radio, in a lot of ways, helps us to see how the border travels, helps us to see where our communities are, and helps show us what is the impact of our cultural productions. So with that, I will turn it over to Sonia, and I very much welcome your questions at the end of her talk. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Monica. I am very excited about your work, right? And obviously your book. And I think that this contribution to the behind the scenes work, the really important, work that takes place is really important, is important. And I think, we can't wait in the media studies community, right, to receive your work. So early congratulations, I guess I should say, right, because I know it's going to come out in early next year. So thank you everybody again for joining us. I know we have a webinar, right, and we also have other forms, right, of streaming. I wanted to introduce myself briefly. I teach history. I'm a historian, so this part of the lecture, right, is a little bit more of the behind the scenes. Some of more of the background information. I'm going to talk a little bit about my book, but focus, right, and highlight on advertising specifically. And I have these three images here, right, on this title slide, because I do want to highlight that the stations that I looked at and the stations that I examine, that I'm still writing about, are small stations, right? They are, stations like the image that you see right in this picture. XEU, right? These were low power stations that transmitted, from Mexico to the United States between 1931 and the late 1940s. And I appreciate that Monica talked about the archive, because I do think it's important, to realize that as media scholars, right, especially in the early 20th century, but even later, we have a difficult time collecting archives, and we have a difficult time, putting together actually what was transmitted. So I examined over 100 radio station archival, collections, right, in Mexico's vast and varied, different, types of archival system. And I was able to come to a series of conclusions, right, in my work. But more than anything, I really wanted to highlight Mexican entrepreneurs. I wanted to put them in the middle. As Monica said, right, with this talk, we're hoping to really highlight, some of the work that goes into, creating media. So I wanted to highlight entrepreneurs and really talk about this intersection between communications media and technology, right? The technology that is used, right, that is basically, connecting, people not only during this time period, but, continues to be really crucial for communications media. So for Mexican Waves, the book that University of Arizona Press published in 2019, I focused on a series of things. I focused on the strategies, used to lure and to maintain radio audiences, on control mechanisms, the ways that the Mexican government established a surveillance system, how radio entrepreneurs both challenged that system, but also, worked with it, sometimes, to their own benefit, right, and definitely, right, in crooked, right, and corrupt ways. I examined the role of the stations, right, as both springboards, for the artists traveling to and from Mexico, to make records, to go on tours, to go to New York, or, San Antonio, Texas, and also engage Mexican audiences in the United States. And finally, the book studies advertising, right? And it places the advertising right in the context of borderlands history and transnational media studies. I really engaged the work of Alexis McCrossan, Laura Isabel Serna, Colin Gunkel. They influenced a lot of the ways I thought about these Mexican radio stations along the border, mostly by highlighting two things. The first, consumer culture as a transnational phenomenon, something that, didn't start with the internet, right, of course, right? And also showing how certain media, right, in the case of Colin Gunkel and Laura Isabel Serna specifically, how they were these transnational social spaces. So thinking of media in this way, I was able to do the same, right, and to see some of those echoes in my work. So if we can go to the next slide. I wanted to focus then today, and evening, right, or this afternoon, wherever you are, right, on the role that Mexican stations played, really connecting these communities, right, both in Mexico and also in the United States. So I'm going to focus on four different things, right? How, the use of Spanish language press, came about, right, for this publicity, how they sponsored transborder contests, how they interacted with amateurs and hobbyists. And then finally, this specific, aspect of advertising for Mexican businesses and services here in the United States. Next slide. I wanted to begin, right, by, I think, reminding everybody right here, right, that until the mid 20th century, programming in radio included music, right, included propaganda in the form of public health bulletins, things like, washing your hands, also something like participating in the census, right? This would be really useful propaganda bulletin. campaign, political campaign information, right? Instruction. There was a lot of advertising, but there wasn't any news, right? I think that it's really important, to remind us that, right? We think of community radio, right? Or we think of small radio stations, and maybe we just think of news. This was not, the news kind of radio. This came after, right? The mid-20th century. So, the first ways that Mexican radio stations really connected with communities, right, was, by using the Spanish language press. Here you see, right, this publicity from a station, in Monterrey that's advertising in a Spanish language newspaper, all the way in San Antonio. And they're really getting at their audience by trying to lure them in, are you Mexican, right? Do you like Mexican, or do you like Mexican music, right? You could kind of choose this category. And, they're basically saying, tune, you can tune basically, your receivers, wherever you are in Texas, right? And then you could pick us up, right? And so there's a series of these advertisements, not only in La Prensa, right, but in other Spanish language newspapers. La Opinión is a classic one, right, in Southern California, right, that also, used its pages, right? Stations use its pages to advertise. So another way, right, that stations participated in this creation, right, of this transborder community, I have on the next slide, right, is by sponsoring transborder contests. So in October of 1939, radio station XEMU of Piedras Negras, Coahuila, announced the beginning of a months-long concurso de simpatía, right, a beauty contest. The Texas San Antonio Spanish language newspaper, right, that I just mentioned here, partnered with a Mexican station and covered the contest. La Prensa updated readers on names and background information of the young women who participated, and later published special events organized by the contestants. When the competition was reaching its final stages, right, in early March, the newspaper reported that if the contestants, if the organizers, and the surrounding community wished to hear the vote count, right, that XEMU would broadcast the results on the air daily, right? So what you see here has actually been published after they spoke it and live on the air. So this caveat really kept the station relevant, right, and really useful in the contest. Since the press noted that the updated vote count, would only be revealed right in the air before it was published. It was also very much a transnational contest because the committees, right, social clubs, and young women who participated, lived in small, right, and large cities across the valley, right? If you take a look, and I don't know if you can see, right, if you can kind of zoom in here, right, we have, Crystal City, Texas, right, but we have, smaller places as well, right? Ondo, Texas, for example. And I think, 6 months after, right, it was announced that this contest began, right, the station, announced the winner over the air, right, a young woman by the name of Vasalia Acuña. And the contest culmination, coincided with the radio station's 3rd anniversary. So to celebrate then, they organized a grand ball, right? They invited, the local townspeople, right? The local governor, right? And, basically just, had a big party, right? To celebrate this, the culmination of this contest. And so, these Mexican radio stations played a number of functions, right? Of social functions. This is the second one, right? I also have another one in addition to this, right? On the next slide. They engaged with a radio amateur culture, right, in the United States. I have very recently, right, and this also comes, we can talk about archives later, maybe, right, how we collect, archival information and where we find archival information. But most recently, I've come across a series of postcards, right, that radio amateurs collected. The Mexican stations engaged with a radio amateur culture, right? The ham radio, right? If you're familiar with this type of, amateur radio, this ham radio's technical culture. Historian Kristen Herring has written about this, but it's really an international culture, right, as well. That amateurs collected these cards from different places all over the world, right? They organized into social clubs, they would have contests for who could pick up the most stations, right? Certain amounts of time. And so this was another way, right, that these Mexican, border stations participated, right, in their local community. But the last one, right, and the one that's on the next slide is the bulk, right, of what I wanted to spend, this evening talking about, right, which was about the ways that Mexican stations advertised, right, for immigrant-owned, Spanish language businesses in the United States. So I have 3 examples of the ways that this came about, which you can see here, right, in front of you, is a copy of a report, right, that a station in Mexicali had to submit to the Mexican government every quarter, right? And so the archive contains, these quarterly reports, right? And if you start to dig through them, right, and if you kind of see, you realize that, they not only note the business, right, that they advertise for, right, but they also note its location, and also, how much they charge, right, for the specific, advertisement. And so I think you can see here, right, in this case, right, there was a pharmacy, right, there was a market, right, there was a theater, located all in the United States, right, in Los Angeles and in Calexico. That the station actually, was advertising for. And when Mexican media policy changed in 1944, the government began to collect an additional surcharge, for all stations that were still transmitting, abroad. And the surcharge, ranged anywhere from 50 to 75%, right, of everything that they were collecting. But what I found, right, through my research, and what I'm still, in the process, I think, of kind of figuring out a little bit more as I get into the numbers, is that stations continued to broadcast, right, for these Mexican immigrant-owned businesses, right? Even though they had to pay this additional surcharge, they still continued to broadcast throughout the war. And there isn't really any change until 1947, right, 1948. So in addition to a station, right, in Mexicali, right, there was also a station, for example, in Ciudad Juarez, station XCFW. In the second trimester, right, of 1944, this station advertised for 5 clothing stores, 3 grocery stores and markets, 4 body shops, right, and all, in 1 theater, the Teatro Azteca, right, not a surprise on the name here, right, that was all, they were all located in El Paso, Texas. And in the same trimester, right, so it's the second trimester of 1944, another station along the border, but further, along the river, right, in Piedras Negras, advertised for 2 clothing stores, 1 bakery, 1 photography studio, 1 print shop, and 1 grocery located in Eagle Pass, Texas, right? So across the border. So as I said, right, despite this additional tax, Mexican radio stations continued to air Spanish language advertisements. And it was one of the ways, right, that we're able to see the Mexican government's acknowledgement, right, of these practices, these transborder practices that we're carrying on. And so for my last slide, right, and just to kind of conclude this, I just basically wanted, to remind audiences, right, and listeners, right, that the stations, they're not all just border blasters, right? On the left, you see an image, right, of XCEAW, right? One of the famous border blasters that emerged in the 1930s, and border blasters actually still, are around, right, in some way, shape, or form, right, today. I think, if not, if anything, right, in basically, popular culture, right, and in memory. But border blasters, and you can see here from the ways that XEAW, publicize themselves, they only meant to target, the English language, audience. We can't really see that through the waves, but they only meant to target, audiences in the United States, right, essentially. They didn't necessarily see themselves, right, and place themselves in the center, right, in the ways that smaller, right, Mexican-owned radio stations did, like this station here, right, XEJ of Ciudad Juarez, right. You can see that how they place themselves right in the middle of these 2 countries, right, and they intended to serve, right, Spanish language audiences, both in Mexico, right, but also in the United States. And so I think it's useful, right, as we think of, ways, right, to sort of narrate the border, right, as we were talking about at the beginning, and expand, this understanding that media, right, has really crossed these borders, right, and it continues, right, to do so at the same time. So thank you for your time. I think we can definitely, take questions and move on to the Q&A period.
Thank you so much to you both for fascinating talks. We're going to see if any questions have come through. Just really interesting to hear about these histories that are just not as well known as they should be. And I think especially for me personally, as a feminist, as somebody who's a part of a community radio station, which is really not a common thing nowadays. Yeah, just really striking, and especially in this location. Okay, so we got our first question. Is there any connection between the availability of Chicano radio stations in the U.S. and awareness of Chicano music?
I mean, are people aware of music but not of the stations? Is that the question? Sort of. I guess, yeah, that's a great question. I think probably the music is more recognized, right? That music is, hopefully played more, not just on community stations, but other stations. But that's a really interesting question. I think that radio history, I think in general, is not something that's really at the center of media studies. I think we're much more fascinated with the visual aspect of media sometimes. But yeah, I would say definitely the music is much more recognized than the stations.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, when each of you sort of talked about archival material being non-audio, and just thinking about the ways that things that are hidden are being brought to light by the work that both of you are doing. And I really liked the thing that you said about, even if we're not in the narrative, we're still there, kind of a thing. I thought that was cool. Okay, another question for each of you. How long have you been working on radio?
Forever. No, I mean, this has been, my book is, as Sonia could probably share too, it's been a long process, starting with graduate school and my dissertation. It's very much been a long road, but one that I'm, has been very thankful and have embraced mostly with joy, some frustration, mostly around not being able to find radio shows. I think that's been the hardest part, is because wanting to listen to what they were covering, but it's been a long time.
Yeah, I started to do the research in 2007. So yeah, it's been a long time, but it doesn't matter. I've spoken to scholars who've studied radio for 30 years and still say they can't understand, Mexican radio, for example, right? So I think there's just a lot of layers, to the aspect. There's the technological history part, right? I think there's the archival part. The political part, right? I think there's the language part, right? There's just so much to say. So yeah, I'm grateful for somehow ending up right in this field. Mm-hmm.
That was really interesting. Thinking about technology as another part of the behind the scenes work. I think that's definitely a part that I forget about as a DJ. And it's like, oh yeah, how do you even get this to broadcast in the first place? Okay, another question. Has there been any cross-border exchange or influence in announcer styles or approaches? And I leave it to either one of you to speak to that, but maybe Dr. De La Torre slightly more.
Can you repeat the question? Has there been
cross-border exchange or influence in announcer styles or approaches?
That's a good question. I don't think I've know enough about the styles of Mexican DJs. Well, no, that's not true. I would say that the radio dramas are very much part of that tradition, right? But I would say that the inclusion, maybe Sonia can speak to this a lot more, but the inclusion of the health aspect, right? I think having the radio serve as like an all-purpose, place for folks to come and learn about a variety of information. But I think definitely the tradition of like the storytelling on the airwaves. So maybe not specifically a style, although I would say the personalities, the characters, but I think that's across all radio, not just Mexican or border radio, sort of the big personalities on air. But I would say that the narrative storytelling aspect is definitely one of those.
Yeah, I mean, I found a couple examples in the archive and also just kind of through biographies, right, of stations that wanted operators that were bilingual because they could, they like specifically for advertising, right? They could actually say, Nestle, carnation milk, right, or whatever it may be, like and say it in a way, right, that the audiences would recognize. I think that, when that didn't happen, they would play recordings of, specific advertisements, right, when they didn't have like the really good sort of bilingual speaker. But I think it's important to remember, right, that this was early on, right? This is 30s and 40s, and they're already kind of being really specific about the fact that they, they don't want to hear at that thick, accent, because it's going to distract, from, listeners, and people won't want to buy, right, the product. So I definitely, I didn't find a lot of anecdotes of that, but it's definitely there, right? And since the 1930s, the desire to, if you're bilingual, right, if you've gone to Los Angeles to an operator school, right, and somehow you make it back, to Mexico, you're going to get a job, right? Because you have that, even if you've just heard English, for a while, you're able to basically communicate that way. And that's really useful. Mm-hmm.
All right, this question specifically for Monica. Could you say a little more about the language choices in these radio stations and what influences those choices?
Yeah, so I think for Radio Cadena in particular, there was no Spanish language media in the Yakima Valley in Washington State. So the fact that they decided to broadcast in Spanish was because they knew that their target audience was Spanish speaking. In a place like California at KBBF, where they decided to do a bilingual station, I think that also speaks to the community there, that they were working with not just farm workers, but students and other community activists. Not that that wasn't happening at other stations, but the explicit, audience that they were trying to capture at these stations, I think, speaks to what the language choice was. But Radio Cadena still aired, and Chicano community stations aired English content. They a lot of the times would air NPR, news or NPR programs. They were NPR affiliate, and so there was English programming. They had like a blues and jazz early on, blues and jazz hour. But for the most part, they knew that farm workers, their language of comfort and intimacy was Spanish. And again, because there wasn't any other outlet, they tried to do a newspaper, but that didn't work. And TV broadcasting was just too expensive. So, just more technically challenging to create. But I think the audience very much dictated that choice.
Thank you. I guess it also makes me think about radio being such a kind of egalitarian medium for conveying information, and pretty communal, because you could just overhear it, if somebody's playing it. You don't need totally special equipment, like maybe owning a TV. Mm-hmm. All right, this next one's for Sonia. So in your research, have you found a significant presence of women announcers in some of these border Mexican stations that you looked at?
So I wish I could say yes, but I have not, right? I think that the women's voices are through music, right? And, thankfully, they're great voices, and that has been chronicled, absolutely, right? But I think that operators, it's hard to get even just, you know, a good sense from them in the archives. I think, you know, I have more of the who was controlling the stations and, you know, who was surveying, you know, the surveillance part of it, that aspect. I definitely, you know, have been able to find information, but no, I wish that yes, that there was this, you know, and hopefully, you know, something will come up, I think, in the future, but no, I haven't been able to. This is also why I think, you know, Monica's work is so great. You know, in addition to just, you know, basically, you know, talking about the community aspect, I think just really bringing to the forefront, you know, Chicana voices, right? I think that this is really great.
I love like all the pictures of the Chicana broadcasters. They're so good. I was so happy about
They're
that
the
website.
best.
Oh my gosh, they look like so cool, you know?
Yeah,
Man.
agreed.
And this one isn't for anyone specific, so I'll leave it to either one of you, but can you tell us maybe about a time where you really felt the impact or importance of community radio?
I mean, for me, it's ongoing because as a researcher, as a feminist researcher, my radio cred is what's gotten me through the door. I've gotten that from a lot of the people I've interviewed. They've said to me, you know, it's your background in radio and specifically community radio that you know, made me interested in wanting to talk to you, because I think that, you know, as researchers, you know, we sometimes get, you know, deservedly so, sometimes a bad rap for coming into the community and taking knowledge and then never coming back. But I think that the community radio aspect of it keeps me grounded to what who I want this work to reach, right? I want it to reach students and scholars, but ultimately this is our history as a community, right? As folks that are impacted by this type of programming. So I think that I see it impact me in just my interactions with people and in how I am able to connect with them.
Yeah, and for me, I mean, I think I since I haven't had that experience as in the operator side, right? I will say that community radio, it's definitely has led me to want to ask more questions, right? And I think that this is, you know, part of what I like about what I do, right? I think, you know, just, you know, asking those really good questions that kind of, you know, lead, you know, to a greater understanding, right, of how, you know, how everything kind of came together. I mean, although at the same time, I do think, you know, maybe, yeah, it's through this archival, you know, collection and through this research process that I think that you really do appreciate the role of community radio. I mean, I think, I don't know, the first time I saw, you know, Pedro J. Gonzalez's papers, right, you know, at UCLA, you know, Chicano, you know, research studies archive. I mean, I think, yeah, you get to see it, right? You know, not only the images, right, but also the correspondence, you know, the ways that, you know, basically, you know, Mexican immigrants were communicating with him, right, and, you know, reminding him of how great it was, you know, to listen to him at 4 a.m, right, as they were getting ready to go, you know, to go to work, right, that day and out in the fields. And so I think that it's been through that, you know, just more of an appreciation for me. But I will say that, you know, this is still like a very new field, right? And I think, you know, we're making, you know, headways. So.
Okay, next question. So do either of you have any thoughts or opinions you'd like to share about incentivizing the younger demographic to engage with and listen to the radio?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we have to, I think it's important to historically contextualize. I know that maybe for students that might be a little boring sometimes, but again, I think for me, the impact of this work was seeing myself reflected in these images, right? And so I think that podcasting, you know, digital shorts, all of that has a legacy in radio. The format of radio, again, the storytelling, the narrative, you know, has all been the sound production, right? That all has been imbued in Hollywood, in mainstream media productions, and that has a lot to do with radio. And so I think that when I talk to students about this, it usually is, just, I think, centering the importance of telling our own stories, right? And so I think when you approach it that way, that this is just another way of sharing knowledge and information that usually gets sidelined or ignored altogether. That's a really great entry point. That it's a device, it's a format that may be old, but actually, has very much current implications. And I think that when I talk to students about radio, I don't think they realize that they actually do listen to it more than they think about, right? As you get into the car, as you are just walking sometimes in stores or public spaces, as you said earlier, right? That it's just something that you can catch in the background. And so I feel like when I ask, do you listen to the radio? Sometimes it's no, but then it's like, oh, but wait. And so I think that it's still a lot more, it's doing its job, that it's in the environment and we don't notice it, right?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I don't think that people realize how influential it is. And then the audience is really interested in hearing from each of you about your future research agendas, like what's up in the coming future.
I mean, I can go, I guess. So yes, the Smithsonian is, obviously has many things, right? But in its archival collections, there's a guide. I mean, they have a pretty extensive collection, right, of what they've titled, Hispanic advertising agencies. And so this is television, mostly, right, but also, some radio. I think you're right, Monica, or I actually remember, right, who said it exactly, right? But the sense that, that we tend to go towards the visual, right, but sometimes like forget to make this link between, the oral, right, AURAL, right, and basically the visual, right? So there's a lot of these advertising agencies that actually began, right, with radio and then moved over, right, to television. So I'm interested in exploring, that collection. I think it's, Kathleen Franz, right, is the leader there at the Smithsonian, and she's traveled all over the US, collecting, all of these, different types of informations, right, personal papers, right, archives, again, et cetera. And so I'm going to get into that collection, right, as well. I mean, also, now that I'm here, right, on the East Coast, it's a little bit easier for me to do this research, right, than being elsewhere. And in addition to that, I'm also, studying a woman who ran Mexico's public education radio station from the 1924, right? Basically like early public radio in Mexico, and it wasn't even really called public radio. It was actually just state-sponsored radio. And so a woman by the name of Maria Luisa Ross was the manager, the behind the scenes everything, not only the person who basically not contract, but it invited speakers, but also the person who got doctors to show up in front of the microphone to say to say their health bulletins, the one who corresponded with amateurs. I mean, she basically did everything, right? And for about a decade. So I'm writing about her, and that's specifically focused on Mexico.
Well, I shared a little bit of future research. I'm hoping to go more into Graciela's archive. I've only been able to look at all the 600 pictures, or close to 600, and most of those are online. So, but I hope that I'll be able to go into the archive and learn more about her television network ownership. There isn't a lot about that, so I'm really hoping that there's more information out there, and I just hope to continue to expand on her legacy. I'm hoping to apply for some grants to take this Chicano public radio archive and start to maybe do more oral history interviews with other radio station, producers and DJs. Hopefully that'll be something that could be expanded, because as you could see, there's just so much. And again, this is just a little a little bit of, I think, what's out there. So again, I'm hoping to just do more work, more public scholarship, but also more writing about different radio and television public broadcasting stations.
I mean, I guess I'll also say that, you know, I met Monica, right, ages ago at the Radio Preservation Task Force inaugural meeting in Washington, D.C., right? This was sponsored by the Library of Congress. I mean, the Radio Preservation Task Force still exists, thankfully, right? You know, despite, you know, a series, right, of administrative changes, right? And I think, you know, budget cuts and et cetera, et cetera. And so there is a Spanish language radio caucus that, you know, Dolores Inés Casillas from UCSB, you know, that she's like our, you know, our great leader, right? That we definitely, you know, always credit and, you know, and want to, you know, basically, you know, make sure that we keep it alive. And we have met twice, but the third meeting was supposed to happen last year, right? I mean, I think, you know, it's who knows when we'll meet again, right, as a task force, but I think, you know, we still exist, right, at least, you know, virtually. And so, you know, there's scholars, not just historians, right, or, you know, media scholars, but also librarians, archivists. The task force is really great at, you know, at uniting, you know, a good, you know, a core group of people to really discuss, you know, radio preservation, archival collections, you know, ways to get, you know, to get people involved and really tell the story of local radio, right? Not just the national broadcasting network story. So.
Great. Well, thanks to you both so much. That concludes our Q&A session. I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Javier.
Thank you, Miranda.
Thank you so much to the three of you for this fascinating conversation. And I think at some point in the future, we'll bring you back for maybe a conversation regarding some connections between the internet and radio. I think that'd be a fascinating conversation, given that how much the internet has proven to be a huge factor in terms of bringing people together. So I'm personally curious about that topic, and maybe some other day we can explore such a possibility. But for now, again, my thanks to the Conference Center team that makes everything possible, to Miranda for graciously accepted to moderate, and to KXCI. We look forward for more collaborations with KXCI and other folks in the community. Sonia and Monica, muchísimas gracias. I really, really appreciate your willingness to work with us and also to share your amazing work, and look forward for more findings and discoveries that you do in this really, really, truly illuminating subject that I think we have a lot to learn still. I want to invite everybody to join us on November 16th for our show and tell series. And also on November 29th, Professor Socorro Tahuenca from the University of Texas El Paso would be part of this lecture series. More on that, mark the date. And for now, again, my thanks. Que cuídense mucho. And thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful evening and be well. Gracias.